Well, today we find Jesus moving between Samaria and the lower regions of Galilee, where he enters a village and is met by 10 lepers, as you just heard. And Luke adds a little detail that we need to understand if we're going to understand this gospel. Luke says that the lepers stood at a distance and shouted, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." Now, what you need to know is that in the book of Leviticus in the Old Testament, there was a rule for how the Jews were to handle lepers and leprosy. Leprosy was a skin disease that was both communicable and terminal, and it was considered contagious and deadly. And so lepers were banned from the city or town, and if someone were to come close, the lepers were supposed to shout, "Unclean, unclean." They were supposed to ensure a distance between themselves and those who were well so that the disease wouldn't be passed along. But instead of crying out, "Unclean, unclean," the lepers cry out, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." They ask for mercy and pity and call him Master or Lord. And he does respond to them by telling them to go show themselves to the priest. And that is because of what is also in the book of Leviticus. It's chapters 13 and 14, if you're interested in that sort of thing. Doesn't make for really good reading, but you might find it interesting. Now, one of the duties of an Old Testament priest, in addition to offering sacrifices in the temple, was to act as a kind of a doctor in examining people's sores, whether or not they had leprosy, and to decide whether the person was clean or unclean based on the kind of sores they had. And so Jesus sent them to the priest who would examine them to ensure that their leprosy was gone. And it was at that point that they would be reinstated to their communities. While the lepers are on their way to the temple, they're cleansed of their leprosy. And one of them, the Samaritan, a foreigner, recognizes a need to thank Jesus, and so he goes back to Jesus. Luke says that he glorified God and gave thanks to Jesus by falling at his feet. It's kind of a twofold thanksgiving. He recognizes that God has healed him of his leprosy, but he also recognizes that Jesus has healed him as well. And he falls on his face. He prostrates himself. That's a rather strange thing for a Samaritan or a Jew to do. They would not fall prostrate before fellow human beings and take on a posture of worship to another human being. And yet, while he's glorifying God, he falls on his face. And Luke uses the word Eucharisteo. He Eucharists Jesus. He gives thanks to Jesus for healing him. And it's a recognition of the divinity of Jesus. And notice that Jesus sees and hears it all, and he doesn't say, "Please stand up, I'm just a man," which is what Paul does in the book of Acts when pagans try to worship him, or what the angel says in the book of Revelation when John falls on his face before the angel. No, Jesus accepts the honor from the Samaritan, and instead he asks, "Weren't there 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? And then he tells the Samaritan to rise, to go your way. Your faith has saved you. All right, so what are the takeaways from today's gospel reading? Well, there are quite a few of them actually, but I'd briefly like to explore just 2. And the first is this. When we've received a gift, the proper response is one of gratitude. As believers, we recognize that we've been graced by someone, and our gratitude to that person becomes gratitude to God, whom we recognize as the ultimate source of every gift that we receive. And that's what distinguished the Samaritan leper from the other 9 who were healed as well. All 10 had been greatly gifted because the illness that kept them isolated from everyone except for their fellow lepers had been taken away. Only one of them recognized that the ultimate source of that wonderful blessing was God. Finding himself cured, the Samaritan turned back, praising God at the top of his lungs, and he threw himself at the feet of Jesus. Now, we are called to grow in that same vision of faith, and it's good to take time to name the ways that we've been graced, to recognize God as the source of all these gifts, and to lift our hearts in praise and thanksgiving to God. And our presence at Mass is a wonderful opportunity to do just that. As I mentioned, the word Eucharist comes from the Greek word for thanksgiving. And at Mass, we enter into Jesus' own prayer of praise and thanksgiving to the Father, and we are caught up into the prayer of the risen Lord. Through him and with him and in him, we return thanks for all that we receive. The other thing that I'd like to briefly touch upon is this. There is now a cure for physical leprosy, so most of us will never contract it. But we all suffer from a spiritual leprosy because we are all sinners. And just like the physical leprosy of old, spiritual leprosy is both contagious and deadly. And just as if you had a really bad case of leprosy in the Old Testament, in order to be declared clean, you had to go to a priest. Well, the same is kind of true in the New Testament as well, especially if we're dealing with serious sin. It's appropriate to go to a priest in the sacrament of reconciliation to be declared clean so that we can be reintegrated into the worship in the temple that is now the holy sacrifice of the Mass and the Eucharistic liturgy. And just a quick reminder, we have reconciliation here every Saturday at 4. You can also make an appointment, and I will gladly add additional times when it might be more convenient for you.